I guess. Probably she'll keep bringing them. Bran whistled softly. Damn. So Elijah's only 4? He's big for 4. A shadow crossed over Shay's face. They grow fast. Bran nodded. Oh, I'm aware. He gestured to Kat, who looked like a young woman in her late teens or early 20s. She's only 3. A faint smile. Yeah, she told me. It wasn't just that Elijah had grown fast, because that kid was fucking enormous. Had to be well over 200 pounds, and all of it muscle. But then Bran thought of that look that had crossed over Shay's face when he'd mentioned Elijah's size. He's big, Bran realized, because his father's big. Bran swallowed. This alpha male, Khan, does he ever come around? If he does, he doesn't show himself, Shay said, her tone flat. I think, in a way, he's scared of Elijah. Maybe that's why they want to kill the male hybrids when they come along, because they're a threat. A shrug. And that's my theory anyways. This is Elijah's territory now. They lapsed into an awkward silence. Bran tried to think of something else to say, but really, he had quite enough to digest as it was. And he knew how this was going to wind up anyways. No point in asking a bunch more questions when it ultimately wouldn't matter. Maybe Shay would let Bran stay until he healed up a bit more. Or maybe he and Kat would be hitting the road that very day. He just hoped he could convince her to give him something to eat before they left. Because if she didn't, Bran thought he'd start eating the bark off the trees. Seeing that their information swap had come to an end, Shay stood, put her hands on her hips, looked out the window, looked at Bran, looked at Kat, then back to Bran. Her expression became very stern. If you're going to stay with us, then there's one rule that is absolutely non-negotiable. If you can't promise me that you'll follow that rule, then you can just get gone. Bran's eyes widened. Then he frowned. You're going to let us stay? She ignored that question. My one rule is this, Bran. No violence. These boys, my boys, they've got a hard enough time keeping their instincts in check. I'm trying to teach them how to function like normal people, but it is, she grimaced, an uphill battle. And the last thing I need is you two, and particularly you, Bran, because you're a man, setting a bad example. Bran blinked a few times. So, we can stay? Promise me, no violence. Ma'am, I hope to never have to be violent again. Hoping's not good enough, she said. Just don't do it. Ever. Promise or leave. Bran raised his hand as though he were swearing an oath. I promise. She pointed a finger at him. And I'm not saying you can stay forever. Okay. She flicked that finger up and down. Just until your stitches come out. Then we'll see how things work out between now and then. Chapter 4. Patrick Beckley sat in his trailer, sweating despite the fact that he had every window open. About half of those windows didn't have screens, and the flies were bad this summer. But it was either deal with his unwelcome house guests' constant irritable buzzing and the annoying tickle as they alighted on him and then swiftly flew away again, or let his trailer become a sauna. At least he was in shade. God, but this summer had been hot, and he was tired of the sun. Besides, even if he was of a mind to step outside and deal with the sun, he had no desire to mingle with the people of Windchuck. They'd only badger him with a bunch of questions about Big Black. Did Patrick see him? How far was Patrick able to track him? Was he any closer to putting a bullet in the nasty beast's head? To which he would be forced to answer in order, no, not far, and any day now. Which was true, and wishful thinking. Windchuck wasn't even his settlement, really. He was from O'Brien, another settlement 20 miles away. And he highly preferred it, because the people of Windchuck had it in their heads that they were so much better than folk from O'Brien for reasons that remained a mystery to Patrick. They were just uppity. And all of those questions that they would ask him if he showed his face would be posed with a tone of entitled derision, like he should have caught and killed Big Black a long time ago. They'd say those questions with the subtext of, you have one job. In O'Brien, where Patrick actually called home, they'd ask the same questions, but they'd do it with hope and plenty of sympathy for the difficulty of the task, because they knew that trying to hunt one specific animal in a wilderness of several hundred square miles was no easy task, and because they knew that this was not just a job to Patrick, it was personal, and if there was any way on God's green earth that Patrick could have put a bullet in Big Black already, he'd have done it. Would do it. He absolutely would. All he needed was 2 seconds of visual contact and a rifle in his hands, and he'd have it done once and for all. He sat at the dinette table in the kitchen of the single-wide, slumped back in a crappy old camping chair, his legs sprawled beneath the chipped Formica table, spinning that old Coke bottle cap between his fingers. Spin, spin, spin. The red and white lettering blurring into pink. He was one of those guys that just had a thing for Coke. Pepsi simply would not do. It just wasn't the same. Some people said you couldn't taste the difference, but Patrick could, and Pepsi, or any other knockoff bullshit, lacked a certain something that he couldn't pin down, but he knew it when he drank it, because it reminded him of sweating paper cups filled with pebble ice as he sat in the stands and watched minor league baseball. Good memories from his childhood. Never failed to relax him. He'd drink a beer at a barbecue or whatever, but honestly, Coke was better. At the end of a hard day, he wouldn't reach for a beer. He'd drink a Coke, and then everything would feel like it would be okay. Of course, there'd been a lot of hard days in the past 6 years, and not a whole lot of Coke. Morgan and Sierra had known about what they jokingly referred to as his Coke habit, even though only Morgan was old enough to actually remember it. Sierra had only been 2 when everything went down the drain, but Morgan had been 8, and she'd told Sierra about it. He still didn't know where they found the Coke bottles or the bottle tops. But one day, for his birthday 3 years ago, he'd come home from a 2-day hunt to find a 6-pack of Coke bottles, each filled with that dark brown liquid and capped with actual Coke bottle caps, although those had been a mite rusty. Didn't matter. Wasn't a dose of rust particles that would have kept Patrick from drinking that shit with a smile on his face while his girls beamed, proud of their meaningful gift. He had no idea what the brown liquid was, but it tasted god-awful. Something like fake maple syrup and licorice with an unidentified astringency and mysterious, chewy chunks floating in it, and obviously not carbonated. But he drank the whole bottle right in front of them and never once let the disgust wrinkle his nose, smacked his lips, and sighed with a beatific look to the heavens. "Tastes just like the real thing," he'd told them. "I don't know how you girls did it." They'd been so happy. Morgan and Sierra, all he'd had left in the world. And now this stupid bottle cap was all he had left of them. That's what the folks from Winchuck didn't understand. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't. Trade was brisk between O'Brien and Winchuck, and Patrick kind of assumed that there was plenty of scuttlebutt exchanged along with all the other goods. But if they did know, they didn't care. They thought of him simply as the guy who's supposed to keep the route between settlements safe. Like it was just a job and he was some bored civil worker who'd drag his feet and half-ass shit. But the people of O'Brien knew better, because they'd known Morgan and Sierra, known how much Patrick loved his girls, and they knew that this job was not a job at all. It was a personal obsession. Of course, he'd kill any infected he came across. Humanity and whatever this new species was that had evolved from those infected by the plague could not coexist. Patrick knew this intimately, soul-achingly. There was no other option for the survival of humanity outside of total eradication of the infected. And until that happened, humanity would not thrive again and would continue its slow decline into extinction. Because you could not thrive behind high-voltage wires, having to set up an entire tactical operation just to rush out a few mechanics to tinker with the wind turbines every time there was a power outage. You could only survive. No, until every infected was dead, humanity was only living on borrowed time. Patrick took his job seriously. Respond to reports of sightings, track the infected, and eliminate them. Keep the road between O'Brien and Winchuck safe so that the trading caravans could continue to flow back and forth. But Big Black was his obsession, and not just because Big Black was the alpha male in a pack of infected that had been terrorizing this region of Oregon wilderness since the day that Patrick and his daughters had settled in O'Brien. Not just because it would be a feather in his cap to finally bag the elusive creature. No, killing Big Black would be revenge. "Warren to Pat, how copy?" The radio on the kitchen counter crackled, the transmission coming in fuzzy. Patrick launched himself out of his chair and was at the radio before the transmission even clicked out. The radio in the kitchen was a base station, ham frequency. The big-ass antenna outside, cobbled together from various parts Patrick himself had scavenged. It could reach out for a good ways, but Warren was on a handheld set and clearly at the edge of his range. Patrick swiped up the corded mic and pressed the PTT. "Pat here. I gotcha, but you're a little fuzzy. Go ahead." Warren was a member of Patrick's team of trackers. They'd received 2 reports that morning, one from a farming plot just south of Winchuck's high-voltage perimeter. One of the guys harvesting the wheat field there said he found some fresh scat that looked like it came from infected. The other report came from several miles northeast of Winchuck. A group of 3 hunters out bagging small game said they'd seen infected on a hill opposite them and then promptly gotten the hell out of there. They knew better than to tangle with the fuckers when they were only armed with .22 caliber rifles and 9mm pistols. Patrick had split his team of 6, taking 2 others with him to investigate the scat near the wheat field and sending Warren and 2 others north. The scat was almost certainly from infected, but Patrick had only been able to track for about a mile before the trail ran out along a creek and he couldn't pick it back up on the other side. So he'd returned to Winchuck and the trailer that served as a sort of command post and waited to hear from Warren. Warren only took a second to come back to him with his report. "Fresh sign. Good, solid tracks. Definitely infected. We're right between the dead end of 070 and Whaler Creek. You want us to wait for you?" Patrick considered it for a moment, running a hand through his short-cropped blonde hair, still soaked with sweat. "Can you tell how many?" "They're running single file," Warren said, non-committal. "I got at least 4 distinct footprints." Patrick tripled that number in his mind. Always best to err on the side of caution. "Yeah, wait for us. We're on our way. Give me 15 and keep your head on a swivel in the meantime." "Copy that." Patrick grabbed his rifle from atop the dinette table, a Marlin 1895 45-70 lever action with a loopholed VX Freedom 3 scope. It wasn't a fast-shooting rifle, but 3 of his 6-man team carried carbines with high-capacity magazines for if shit got hairy. What his lever action lost in ammunition capacity, it made up for in power. Infected did not go down easy. You could plug those damn things with half a mag of 5.56 before they finally decided to take a knee. But with the massive 45-70 round, Patrick usually only had to hit them once or twice to put them down. Toting his prized infected hunting rifle, Patrick shoved his way out of the muggy trailer and into bright, hot sunshine again. His 2 guys, Ace and Wendell, were standing outside, preferring the sun to the flies in the trailer. "Warren's got a track up by 070 and Whaler Creek," Patrick announced, clattering down the steps of the trailer. "I'm calling it a pack of 12. Let's roll." Ace and Wendell immediately snatched up their day packs and rifles, Ace with an FN Scar 16, Wendell with a Palmetto State Armory AK variant. Then they hustled for the old green Jeep Cherokee they'd retrofitted to run off ethanol. Maybe that's why Winchuck was so uppity, because they made all the ethanol, both for fuel and for drinking. "Ah, shit," Patrick snapped, skidding to a stop. Drinking had reminded him. Morgan and Sierra, and the terrible brown liquid they'd made. My lucky charm. He bolted back into the trailer. There it was, still laying on the dinette table where he'd left it. Christ, how could he have forgotten something like that? Going out without his lucky charm was just asking to die. He snatched the Coke bottle cap off the table and pocketed it. There. Now he was ready to track. Chapter 5. When Shay had prohibited violence and then said, "Especially you, Bran, because you're a man," he'd figured she'd simply singled him out on account of men typically being more aggressive than women. And if he were being honest, that kind of rankled him. He disliked the implication that he was some mindless beast, completely in thrall to whatever primitive instincts his lizard brain and his testicles conjured up together. Not to mention Kat was way more violent than him, and she was a female. Of course, she was also a hybrid, so he guessed she got a free pass on the aggression thing. But in any case, Bran let it go because A, it wasn't worth arguing about, and B, Shay did ultimately have a point about men being more violent. Well, as it turned out, Bran had interpreted that exchange entirely wrong. After a few days in the monastery, Bran began to see a pattern emerge. It started one evening as they'd been at the dinner table. And yes, it was an actual table with actual dinner on it. Not that Bran was unaccustomed to that. When he'd worked for the guy Colin, he'd had plenty of decent meals on dinner tables. It was just that once he'd hightailed it out of California, he'd figured those days were over. But Shay laid out a good spread. It wasn't a lot of food. There was never any extra, but there was always enough. Most of it came from Shay's garden. Pretty much all the dirt in and around the monastery was put to work growing food, but the courtyard in the center of the monastery's dorms was clearly Shay's pride and joy. She made the boys do the stuff on the outside, but the courtyard garden was all hers. She'd walked through that garden with Bran shuffling stiffly along, telling him about all the plants with evident pleasure. He didn't remember a damn thing she'd said, too much information at once. Except for the potatoes. She'd spent a lot of time talking about the potatoes, which were apparently a staple of their food production. So Shay's dinner spread was mostly vegetables and root crops with some grains, supplemented by whatever animal they'd managed to catch, either through the older hybrid's hunting or through Shay's trapping. It was when she prayed over the food that evening that Bran noticed something. For the last few evenings, he'd simply clasped his hands in front of his face and closed his eyes while she prayed. He wasn't the praying sort himself, nor had his family been while growing up, but he knew this was the usual posture assumed when others were praying. It wasn't until that third evening together that Bran dared to open one eye and take a glance at those around the table as Shay set about blessing the meal. At every other meal, the critters that Shay called her boys had simply bowed their heads. But on this particular evening, he found that 4 of them were watching him and mimicking him. The youngest, in particular, Jacob, was openly staring at Bran with his fingers clasped in front of his face and an expression there as though to say, "Am I doing it right?" Bran glanced towards Shay as she thanked the higher power for a bountiful harvest. Saw that her eyes were open too, and she'd noticed her youngest 4 imitating Bran. He wondered what she thought about that. Gave her a little smirk and a shrug, a little worried how she'd take it. Her eyes passed over Bran, then over the youngest 4. Then she offered Bran a small, almost wistful smile. "In Jesus' name, amen," she concluded, almost with a sigh. "Let's eat." Bran gave those 4 younger hybrids another look as he unfolded his hands. Shay didn't seem to go in for much in the way of traditional table manners, or maybe she'd tried to teach them, but they just didn't take. In any case, everyone just grabbed what they wanted and went to town, eating with their hands. So Bran had reached for a boiled potato. Immediately, the 4 younger hybrids jolted forward as though it were a race between them to see who could snag a potato first. Then they put the potato on their wooden plates and went back to intensely watching for Bran's next move. A little taken aback by this, Bran frowned lightly. Jacob, only 9 months old at that point, but already the size of a 5 or 6-year-old, sat rocking in his seat with his little claw-tipped fingers poised to strike and a shit-eating grin on his face. A shit-eating grin. Bran chuckled in amazement. He didn't think he'd ever seen Cat actually smile. He'd come to figure that maybe the primals and hybrids just didn't emote like that. And yeah, coming from a hybrid, the grin was way too wide, with way too many teeth that were way too long, but it was still a smile and it lit up the kid's eyes. Should have been creepy, but it wasn't. When Bran grabbed a pear, they grabbed a pear. Amused now, Bran picked up the potato on his plate and made to take a bite. The 4 hybrids did the same. Then he pulled a switcheroo and went for the pear. Momentary confusion on their part as they hesitated, halfway to biting into their potatoes, then quickly switched to the pears. And then what Shay had said came back to him and made a whole lot more sense, and drove home to him the seriousness of the situation and what Bran represented to them. They were all boys without fathers. Shay was the only adult they'd ever known. Somehow they had instinctively imprinted on the first adult male they'd ever met and seemed compelled to imitate his example. Well, shit, he thought, forcing his attention to the food. I've never had to be a good example before. The responsibility of it was suddenly heavy on his shoulders. As the days went by, Bran regained most of his strength and began to feel a lot more like himself. He started helping out in the garden as much as he was able. Bending over was still not a good idea for him, but he could carry things, and that's how he made himself useful, holding wicker baskets while Shay filled them up with what she harvested for that day's meals. Breakfast was typically whatever fruits and nuts they could gather. Shay had a few fruit and nut trees growing on the compound, but she'd started them from seed, and they wouldn't be producing anything for another few years. But the older boys had a wide range that they scavenged from, and apparently had found an old orchard. Almonds and pears were in season. Later, there would be apples and walnuts, Shay told him. Lunch was typically skipped so they'd have more for dinner. Bran got to know the boys a little better and learned their names. It was fairly easy enough to tell them apart by how big they were. Other than that, they all had very similar features and skin tone, and Shay kept all their hair cut to the same length. Elijah was the oldest, at 4 years, but he was still fairly aloof with Bran. Not hostile, as he'd been the first 2 times, but distrustful, perhaps? Just old enough and smart enough to have figured out that not everyone was what they claimed to be. Then there was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The hardest to tell apart, on account of them possibly being triplets. They sure looked a lot alike, but they weren't identical. Shay didn't know if they were actually triplets or if they'd all just been born around the same time, but they'd all been left at the edge of the monastery over the course of just a few days. They couldn't really say their own names fully and went by Shad, Mish, and Abed. They were all 3 years old and looked like healthy, well-muscled older teens. They were also inseparable, going everywhere as a single unit. After a while, Bran was able to tell them apart with small details. Shad had a very minor cleft lip. Mish had a scar over his left eye, a tree-climbing incident, and Abed was hyperactive in the extreme. Kid couldn't be still for 2 seconds straight, unless he spotted a rabbit or a squirrel. Then he'd go into a creepily intense stalking mode with his 2 brothers. It was both disconcerting and impressive to watch them hunt, spreading out to cover the animals' escape routes and then slowly tightening their circle until they had it. And lastly, there was Jacob, the youngest. As might be predicted by his behavior at the dinner table, Jacob took quite a shine to Bran. And you know what? Bran liked the little critter back. By far, he was the sunniest of the bunch, always beaming out that predator-toothed grin of his. He couldn't really talk much, but then he was only 9 months old and probably hadn't been taught much. Jacob became Bran's shadow. If Bran was holding a basket for Shay to put the harvest in, he was there, offering up his arms for any overflow. If Bran had to take a breather, Jacob would go sit next to him. If Bran scratched his nuts, Jacob would scratch his. If Bran let out a tired sigh, it got echoed right back, just a little higher pitched and a lot more melodramatic. But Bran wasn't the only newcomer, and if Jacob had taken a shine to Bran, then all the boys had practically fallen in love with Cat, which, as it would turn out, presented its own set of problems. Shay was sitting on a stone bench near the wall of the courtyard. The roof overhung the courtyard just enough to get some shade and escape the noonday sun. Bran had just come back from the rain barrel, his stomach sloshing with all the water he'd gulped down, a clay jar in his hand filled for Shay. He slid in next to her and gave her the jar. She thanked him with a smile and took a long draught from it. Bran didn't really know how to bring up his concern, so he decided a roundabout method was best. "So," he began, stretching his legs out in front of him, "how religious are you?" She cocked an eyebrow at him. "I mean," he continued, "just like praying over your food religious? Or are you more of a true believer?" She gave him a sly look. "Why? Does it bother you?" He frowned. "No. Why would it?" She shrugged and looked out at her garden again. "I don't know. Maybe times have changed. I just remember there being a lot of hardcore atheists that'd treat you like a dumb shit if they found out you believed in anything." "Well, I'm not a hardcore anything, so no worries there," Bran said. "But even if I was, this is your house. You make the rules. I wouldn't disrupt that." She intoned. "Not a hardcore anything? What's that mean?" He smirked. Means I'm too dumb to spend much time thinking about deep shit, so I have no opinion on the matter. She turned to him and smiled more genuinely.
I actually think it's a point of intelligence to admit when you don't know something.
Well, I'll take my 1 point of intelligence and be happy with it, thanks. But I was originally talking about you. She puffed her breath out.
Well, I don't know either, Bran.
You don't know if you're religious?
No, I'm religious. I don't know. How can you? I have faith, sure. I hope God exists. I pray to him. But do I know?
She shook her head.
Nope, I don't. No one can.
Bran puzzled over that one. How can you have faith and not believe at the same time?
I didn't say I didn't believe. I just said I didn't know. I acknowledged the possibility that I might die, and that's it. Or maybe I die and there is another side of things, but it's completely different than I thought.
This was starting to veer in a totally different direction than Bran was trying to massage it towards, so he massaged a little harder. But if you had to slap a label on yourself, what would it be?
Well, let's see.
She rubbed a thoughtful thumb along the clay jar.
My mom was Puerto Rican and about 1,000% Catholic, and my dad was as Southern Baptist as they come. They compromised on non-denominational Christian.
She shrugged.
That's how I was raised. It's the theology I'm most familiar with. If I had to slap a label on myself, I'd say Christian.
Ah, there we go. Getting a little closer. In retrospect, it may have just been easier to jump right into what he actually wanted to say, but by now he was too committed to the roundabout path. I see, Bran mulled. So when it comes to how you view, I don't know, let's just go with the low-hanging fruit and talk about sin. Are you pretty traditional in what you consider a sin? Or are you a little more loosey-goosey? Shay gave him an odd look.
Now it kind of sounds like you're about to admit to something, and you want to see how bad I'm going to take it.
Damn it. No. Bran waved her off, trying to maintain his casual, conversational tone. Just curious what your feelings are on things like, I don't know. He waffled a hand through the air as though trying to come up with something, though he knew damn well what he wanted to talk about. Let's go with something like fornication. He dared to glance at her to see how this had landed. She was staring at him, deadpan. Then she burst out a laugh, tried to contain it, and wound up spraying spittle on his cheek.
Oh shit, I'm sorry,
she said, still laughing, raising a hand as though to wipe off his cheek, but he did it for her.
Fornication, Bran? Why? You about to pull some moves on me?
Fuck my life, he thought bitterly. He really should have seen how that question would sound, but Bran wasn't a deep thinker, as he'd already admitted. He backpedaled, maybe a little too hard. No, of course not. Then he had to backpedal from that. Not that I wouldn't. He stopped his runaway mouth, now having backpedaled himself into a corner. He took a moment to breathe the stupid out, while Shay's shoulders shook with mirth. Bran sighed and braced himself, turned to face Shay's laughing eyes, his own gone very serious now. Are you aware that hybrids are sexually mature at 2 years old? Well, that struck the laughter right out of her. Her spine straightened. The hand that had been holding the laughter behind her lips fell away.
Yes, I have 4 boys over the age of...
She trailed off, realization dawning. She turned towards the garden, her eyes darting as though just now realizing that neither Elijah nor Kat was in sight. Just Shad, Mish, and a bed, roughhousing on the far end of the courtyard. Yeah, Bran said, knowing that she'd reached the same conclusion he had. He was a little surprised that this seemed to be the first time she'd thought about it, but then again, she had plenty going on to keep her distracted. Regular teenagers can barely control themselves, and we've got at least 2 hybrids with, I'd venture to guess, much less control over their instincts. Shay, now worried, peered sideways at Bran.
What's your relationship like with Kat?
He drew his head back. What do you mean? Shay cringed, holding up a hand.
Look, I'm not here to judge anyone.
Jesus Christ, Bran hissed, almost getting to his feet. then remembered where he was and who he was with. Sorry. I mean,
I wasn't accusing you of...
you kind of implied it.
Well, I didn't know.
Somewhat ruffled by this, Bran swiped at his pants legs as though to smooth his own hackles. No. Shit. No. Kat's a friend. And I guess kinda like a daughter, in a way, but more like a friend.
So have you talked to her?
He stared at Shay, wide eyes under furrowed brows. About what? The fucking birds and the bees?
Well, yeah.
No. Have you talked to Elijah? Or any of them? Shay shook her head. Look, I'm not going to pretend to know you all that well, since I only met you a week ago, but I'm fairly certain that the last thing you want is for this place to turn into a... He waved his hand around. Fucking breeding ground. Then he realized he might be convincing Shay that Bran and Kat shouldn't stay, and immediately clamped his dumb mouth shut, kicking himself mentally. Right at that moment, the sounds of Shad, Mish, and Abed, roughhousing on the far side of the courtyard, took on a very different tone, like hearing dogs play fighting and then hearing it instantly become serious. Both Bran's and Shay's eyes shot to the triplets. They were a whirlwind of snarling and yapping, not at all friendly sounding anymore. They were practically lost in the cloud of dust they were kicking up, just brown limbs thrashing about. Shay shot to her feet and took off at a sprint, already screaming,
Hey! Hey, stop that!
Bran was much slower, but not for lack of effort. As he hauled after Shay down the center path through the courtyard garden, Bran saw the cloud of dust part and two figures emerge, one atop the other. From this distance, he couldn't tell which was which, but one of the triplets had the other down on the ground, one hand gripping the throat, the other upraised, claw-tipped fingers splayed, ready to rip a face clean off the skull it was attached to. The third member of the triplets burst out of the dust, hooting and jumping around, but not engaging.
Shad!
Shay screeched as she closed with them.
Shad, don't you fucking dare!
Then Shay performed something like a slide tackle, taking the one on top, Bran guessed it was Shad, right in the chest. The triplets were all slightly larger than Shay, though not quite as large as Elijah yet. But Shad had not been prepared for the tackle, and Shay sprawled him backwards into the dirt. As Bran staggered up to them, he saw that it was a bed on the ground and Mish, who'd been hopping around in the background. They were all stone still now, eyes wide, teeth that had been bared to their fullest extent only moments before, now covered by chastened lips. Shay swirled to her knees, both hands planted on Shad's bare chest as he lay on his back. He looked surprised, and maybe a little shamefaced.
What the hell are you doing?
Shay snapped. Okay, let's be easy, Bran huffed. Shay ignored him.
What was that?
She demanded of Shad.
What were you just doing?
Shad's shocked mouth stuttered open. Playing.
That didn't look like playing. That looked like you had your hand on your brother's throat.
None of the triplets responded to that. Shay shook him by the shoulders.
That's not playing. Going for the throat is not playing. I've forbidden you from doing things like that. I've never seen you go for the throat before, Shad. Why would you think that's okay? Who taught you to do that?
More silence, but now punctuated by a whole lot of glances between the triplets. Shay's voice became low and menacing.
Was it Elijah? Did Elijah teach you to go for the throat?
No, Shad answered immediately and sullenly. Shay leaned back, no longer pinning him down. Not that she could have kept Shad down if he'd really wanted to get up. It was only a child's fear of authority that kept him from using his inhuman strength against Shay. She raised her eyes, now glaring slits, and fixed them first on Mish, then turned and fixed them on Abed, who was now sitting up. Abed shrunk under that stare, like watching a plant wither in time-lapse. Bran had a feeling he knew what Abed was going to say before he even said it. Cat, Abed murmured. What? Shay demanded, though Bran wasn't quite sure if she hadn't heard or simply didn't believe. Mish spoke up this time, fidgeting uncomfortably. Just for bad guys. Shay whirled on him.
And is your brother a bad guy?
Mish fidgeted even harder.
Practice?
He tried. Shay rose to her feet. Her lips were drawn thin across her face, eyes still awfully murderous for someone that forbade violence. She glared at each of her boys in turn. Then she glared at Bran. Funny, Bran wasn't the easiest guy to cow, and yet he felt himself wilt a little bit, just like a bed had.
Bran?
Shay breathed. He held up a hand. I know. I'll talk to her. Chapter 6.
Bullshit,
Cat growled.
No, it's not bullshit, Cat.
Bran felt his voice rising and stopped himself, both because he wanted to keep their conversation private and because raising his voice hurt his healing abdominal wound. He'd pulled Cat into the room they'd been staying in, Bran on the bed and Cat on a pile of extra blankets on the floor. Being a pretty traditional man, caveman that he was, Bran had offered her the bed, but she'd only looked at him with a "you're an idiot" expression.
You,
She'd said.
old, broken. You sleep on the bed.
To which he'd rolled his eyes. Gee, thanks. But in this particular instance, Bran's dander was up a bit, as was Cat's, and they were facing each other down across the room. Bran might have been pretty irritated with Cat, but that didn't stop a small part of him from wondering if it was really wise to get her riled. He didn't think she'd rip his throat out. But then again, she'd surprised him before. One must always remember what the hybrids were mixed with and how volatile that made them. God damn it, Cat, Bran grumbled, putting a hand to his smarting wound. Don't you want to try to stay here? Don't you like it here? Some of the ire melted from Cat's expression.
Yes, here is good.
Yes, Bran nodded. Here is good, isn't it? We don't want to ruin a good thing, do we? Cat looked peevishly at the door.
Still bullshit.
Cat? Bran took a step toward her. After all the shit that happened when we left the valley, what did we promise each other? She looked confused for a moment, then remembered, and her expression drew down.
No more dark mode.
That's right. That's what we promised each other. No more dark mode. Dark mode had been their code for, well, not to put too fine a point on it, but basically going apeshit and killing everyone. Back when they'd been the muscle for the ranch owner, Colin, they'd go out to whatever sad batch of squatters they were supposed to evict that day and give them the choice. Leave alive or stay and die. People were weird. Maybe it was that they'd built a life there over the years that Colin had tolerated their presence. Maybe they didn't think they had any place else to go. Or maybe they believed that they actually had a chance to hold out and survive. They never did. Survive, that is. Bran didn't go into those situations wanting to go dark mode, but he had a job to do, didn't he? At least, that's what he'd told himself, because he felt he had to be loyal to the asshole that had saved him from work-release hell, shoveling cow shit in a stockyard. If he could take it all back, he would. If he could go back in time, he'd tell that Colin guy that he was happy shoveling cow shit for minimum wage, thank you very much. And hell, as long as Bran had a time machine, why not go back to that botched robbery and maybe not shoot that guard in the leg? Or better yet, maybe not do the robbery in the first damn place. Though, as long as Bran were wishing, he had to admit, his troubles had started way before then. They'd started the first time he'd ever experienced the thing that he would later call dark mode, back when he'd been a teenager. He could still hear that sound in his head. Clunk. He'd thought the whiskey bottle would shatter like it did in the movies. Never thought it would do what it did. Never thought he would do what he did. Bran winced at the memories and shook his head, saying it one more time, almost like an incantation. No more dark mode. Cat huffed and looked upward in an expression Bran knew meant she was gathering her unwieldy words. When she had them, she met his eyes again, and he waited patiently for her to get them all out.
They need to know how to fight.
She made a motion, her hand going to her own throat.
This good fighting for defense, not dark mode.
Bran made sure she was done. It was hard enough for the poor girl to string that many words together, and he tried to encourage her efforts at speaking and not interrupt, even in an argument, which they were prone to having. Cat, it doesn't matter. Maybe they should be taught how to fight, how to survive. Especially since Shay thinks that this alpha male might still be hanging around. He shook his head and crossed the distance between them. But our opinion doesn't matter. Shay was very clear about the one rule she had if we wanted to stay here. No violence. Kat glared, flashing her teeth. Violence, not always bad. Bran sighed, suddenly feeling ancient, exhausted. Like all the years and all the mistakes within them had come crashing down on him at once. His shoulders slumped and his gaze drooped to the floor. I don't know, Kat. What good has ever come from it? There's a part of me that wants to believe you're right, but most of me is just so goddamn tired of it all. With a real physical effort, he raised his worn gaze to hers. You and me, we've been doing things a certain way for as long as either of us can remember. The usual way. The violent way. But look at us. He raised his arms, then let them flop to his sides again. We had to leave the valley because of all the nasty shit we did back there. And me with a couple of new holes. So what's violence ever brought us, Kat? What's ever come of it but more heartache and more violence? And then, by some miracle, we find this place. A place we can actually call home. A place where you'll be accepted. Where we're not surrounded by a bunch of people that are going to look at you like you're a monster every time you walk down the street. I'll be honest with you, Kat. I'm not sure we'll ever find another place where you're welcome. But you can fit in here. They just have this one rule. That's all we gotta live by. And doesn't that seem like a sign or something? Like maybe we're being given a chance to start over and do things differently? Kat pondered this in silence. She didn't seem to have anything to say back. Bran raised a cautious hand and settled it carefully on her shoulder. Positive physical contact was not something that Kat was overly familiar with, and it wasn't because she was a hybrid. Even the primals showed physical affection and groomed each other, but she hadn't grown up with them. She'd grown up with the asshole Colin claiming to be her father, which he wasn't, and the only physical contact she'd gotten from him was beatings. She glanced at Bran's hand on her shoulder, and for a moment seemed like she might pull away from it, but then he felt her shoulders relax under his touch. Kat, I just want to live in peace for once in my life. And we have a real chance of doing that here. A real chance of having an actual home. He smiled. I know that neither of us really know what that's like, but let's try to give it a chance, yeah? I don't know if Shay's gonna let us stay or not, but if we find ourselves on the road again, I damn sure don't want it to be because we didn't try. Kat let out a low, irritable growl, but Bran knew her little noises, knew this one was the sound of her will, which was quite a monolithic thing, caving in. Fine, she said begrudgingly. We try. No more violence. Bran's smile widened and he gave her shoulder a light squeeze. Hey, John and Yoko said it best. Give peace a chance. Kat frowned at him. Who's John and Yoko? Never mind. He retracted his hand, suddenly feeling awkward again. Yeah, so, speaking about peace and love, man, he was really bad at smooth conversational segues. Do you know how babies are made? Dear God, was he really having this conversation? But that was something he discovered about Kat. Looks could be deceiving. She looked like a woman, but she was still only 3 years old. She was naive, ignorant about much outside of killing. In this case, she surprised Bran. Rutting, she said simply and plainly, not a shred of discomfort or embarrassment. She held up 2 fingers on each hand. Her right hand seemed to mount her left. Male ruts female. Bran nodded, his own cheeks flushing. Found it hard to look her in the eyes. Yup, that's it. Okay, so... He cringed hard. Have you ever had the urge to, rut someone? She considered this, then nodded. Yes. Christ, the small of his back was starting to sweat. He forced himself to look at her. Elijah? She nodded again.
Yes, I would. Rut him.
Bran waved a hand as though calling a ceasefire. Jesus, okay. He wiped his hand over his face. Kat frowned.
You're sweating. Your wound?
Nope, wound's fine. He took a bracing breath. But you know that rutting's what makes babies, right?
Right.
And the last thing we need around here is more babies. Kat seemed perplexed by this, and Bran didn't really want to get into population control, or the simple fact that, while he loved Kat, he wasn't so sure that making more hybrids was really doing the remnants of humanity any favors. Look, he turned back to her. Don't rut Elijah, okay? Or let him rut you, or any of the other boys. Because... No, don't get into the because of things. Just don't. That's my rule. Kat looked immensely displeased.
Now, 2 rules?
Right. 2 rules to follow. That's not so hard, is it? Just don't do violent shit, and don't rut. Kat hissed at him.
Humans. Too many rules.
Bran cocked a laconic eyebrow at her. Kat, I hate to break it to you, but if we went anywhere else with any other humans, you'd find that there's a whole lot more rules than just 2. Exasperated, Kat swiped a hand through the air.
Fine. No violence. No rutting. Bullshit. But fine.
Bran blew out a pent-up breath. Great. Okay. Glad we... Someone knocked on the door. Bran hesitated, feeling somehow caught, though he wasn't sure why. He crossed to the door and opened it. Oh, hey, Shay, he said, kind of surprised and maybe a little miffed that she'd showed up in the middle of their talk. Shay stood in the doorway, not looking at him. She gave Kat a glance, though, and the look was hooded. She did not seem happy. Then Bran glanced down at her hand and saw that she had a small pair of scissors in her hand. Slim and sharp, like what was used to snip threads while sewing. She used them to point to the bed, still not looking Bran in the eye. Time to remove your stitches. Bran's stomach bottomed out. All the hope he'd mustered up while talking to Kat about trying to give this place a chance, trying to make it a home for themselves, it all blew away in the icy wind that seemed to be coming off of Shay. Bran pulled the door open wide and stepped out of her way. He didn't know what to say, but he should say something, shouldn't he? Appeal to Shay? At least put in an effort to convince her? But he found himself silently walking to the bed and sitting down. Kat made to exit the room, but Shay held up a hand.
No, stay. We need to talk.
Kat looked as bereft of words as Bran. Shay closed the door behind her, then crossed to the chair beside Bran's bed. She sat down on the edge of it, looping her fingers into the scissors.
Take off your shirt.
Bran's shirt, and his pants for that matter, were not the ones that he'd arrived in. His old shirt had been bloody and had 2 holes in it. His old pants had also been bloody. Shay had cleaned them as best she could, but chosen to give Bran a fresh set of clothes, which Bran assumed had belonged to one of the monks that had lived here once upon a time. He began unbuttoning the long-sleeve off-white shirt. It was soft and worn in, much like the khaki pants, and they fit him well. He wondered if she'd let him keep them. When he shucked it off, Shay leaned in, first to the wound in his shoulder. He could smell her sweat, and it had a sweetness to it. Her body odor not rank to him at all. But then, maybe he'd just gotten used to being around dirty men that smelled like crotch and spoiled onions. Her eyes remained focused on her task as she gently pulled each individual stitch, snipped off the knot, and then extracted it from his skin. He was surprised how painless it was.
I told you that I had one rule,
she said, her voice stern but controlled. Well, there it was. Listen, Shay. She gave a sharp grunt and snapped her eyes to his.
Let me talk.
Bran shut his mouth. Hell, he didn't really have much to say anyways. Snip.
No violence. And I explained why. I thought I was very clear on that point, but perhaps I failed to express the gravity of the situation.
Snip.
All of these boys here are the sons of Khan. I don't know that for a fact, but I can make an educated guess. Khan was the alpha, and that meant he got first mating priority. He was also the only black male in the troop.
Snip.
It's one thing to be a hybrid. It's another thing entirely to be Khan's offspring.
She paused and leaned back, looking at Bran and holding his gaze unflinchingly.
You don't know Khan, but I do. It's not just that he's big. That's not the only reason he's the alpha.
Her eyes cinched just slightly at the corners, and her voice came out husky and intense.
He's vicious. I know that all the mutants, or primals, or whatever you want to call them, are aggressive. I've dealt with them before. I know how they are. They're animals. And like a wolf, or a lion, or a bear, they're mean and very violent. But Khan is something different.
She seemed to shudder and looked out the window.
Khan is evil.
She stared out for a long time, her gaze hollow. Then, with a sudden intake of breath like she'd been startled, she turned back to Bran.
Lie down. It'll be easier for me to get the stitches on your side.
Bran eased himself down onto his back. He lay there, watching Shay carefully as she leaned in and began to work again. Snip.
Now, I'm not going to argue nature versus nurture with you. I've seen it with my own eyes. People are, at a base level, a combination of their parents. And all of my boys, they're half Khan. They all have a piece of him in their souls. And the only way I know how to keep that piece of their nature controlled is in how I nurture them.
Snip.
I prohibit violence here because I'm not going to open the door to that side of them. I'm not going to give Khan a chance to metastasize inside of them.
One final snip, and then Shay leaned back, both hands clutching the scissors.
I may not be able to stop Khan, but I can stop his legacy. Because the last thing the world needs is more of him.
Now she turned her eyes on Kat, and Bran could see the seething resentment there.
And then you teach them to go for the throat.
Kat crossed her arms over her chest, glaring.
Fighting is not bad.
Bran sat up sharply with a cough. All right, Kat, how about you let me—
No,
Shay snapped.
Let her talk. I want to hear it from her, not from you.
Well, damn it, this was not going to turn out good. Kat glanced at Bran, but there was nothing he could do now, so he just shrugged.
Go on,
Shay said.
Talk.
Kat got that look again, gathering her words. Took her a bit longer this time, so there must have been a lot.
Queen Bee is matriarch,
she began.
She controls the pack. Controls Khan. Queen Bee protects you, but not forever. We?
She made an expansive gesture.
Hybrids grow fast, die young. Queen Bee gets old, is replaced. Other female hybrid, new matriarch, maybe won't control Khan. So?
Kat held up a hand with 2 fingers splayed out.
2 questions. How long before Khan comes back? And who will protect you?
Bran's eyebrows had climbed up his forehead. That was almost fucking eloquent. And it wasn't just him that was impressed. Kat's halting words had struck Shay hard. Her lips were tense, her nostrils flared, eyes wide. Not goggling, but clearly disturbed. And she was silent for a long, long time. Then she stood up.
It's not just Queen Bee that keeps Khan away from us,
she said a little stiffly.
It's Elijah. It's his scent all through the woods every day, marking his territory.
Kat's expression was non-committal. She gave a slow shrug.
Maybe.
Shay blinked a few times, then turned like she'd forgotten what she was doing, seemed flustered for a few beats, then pointed herself for the door and walked out. She didn't close it behind her. Was that a hint for them to leave? Kat looked at Bran, uncertain.
We go?
Bran stood up. I have no idea, Kat. But he followed after Shay, found her in the courtyard garden, aggressively snatching cucumbers from a trellised vine. and when Bran took up the wicker basket again and went to her side, she just deposited the cucumber she'd already picked and went back to work. Neither of them spoke as they worked their way through the garden. Chapter 7. Patrick was on bitch patrol. Everybody on his team had to do it, and today was Patrick's turn. He'd often thought about pulling rank and excusing himself from the work, but a good leader leads by example. And besides, they didn't really have ranks. Patrick was the nominal boss, but they operated more like equals. If he pulled some shit like that, the other guys would probably go along with it, but not without some hurt feelings and major side-eyes. And you know what? Despite what they called it, Bitch Patrol wasn't that bad. It had been named by one of their team, a keg-bellied little Mexican man that Patrick often called my sweet chalupa. Of course, that was not his name. His name was Hugo. Introducing himself, he pronounced it Ugo, but everyone else Americanized it and called him Hugo. Hugo had started calling it Bitch Patrol because usually, whoever was doing it rode in the bed of the lead pickup truck in the trading caravan, a position that Hugo equated to the bitch seat of a motorcycle, and so he had dubbed it Bitch Patrol and the name had stuck. Hugo had a talent for coming up with names that stuck. In fact, Patrick was pretty sure he was the one that had started calling the enormous, dark-skinned alpha male that haunted their territory Big Black. So Patrick was on bitch patrol, riding in the bed of the lead pickup of the caravan as it wound its way in the general direction of southeast, going from O'Brien to Winchuck. There were only 3 vehicles in the caravan today. The lead pickup was an old two-tone Ford 150, followed by a white cargo van with a blue minivan taking up the rear. Once they arrived in Winchuck, Patrick would transfer to another caravan, this one going from Winchuck to O'Brien. Then he'd stay in O'Brien, which he much preferred to staying in Winchuck, until right about sunset. Then he'd ride the Winchuck caravan back to Winchuck, transfer back to the O'Brien caravan, and ride it back home. Patrick had made this trip so many times he knew where every pothole was, where every curve was, and exactly how long it would take. So, without really having to think about it, he knew to brace himself over the washed-out section of road at the bottom of a hill, knew when to lean left and when to lean right as they meandered through the twists and turns of the winding road between the 2 settlements. It freed up his attention to scan the woods to either side, looking for any signs of infected. In the bed with him were a dozen or so empty gas cans, their red faded from too much time in the sun. Their spouts, or donkey dicks as Hugo called them, yellowed with age, a few cracked and mended with old layers of duct tape. All the vehicles in both settlements had been converted to run off ethanol. Winchuck was the one with the grain fields, corn, and wheat, which they then malted, mashed, and distilled into ethanol alcohol. The power dynamic between the settlements had been heavily weighted towards Winchuck pretty much since the beginning. That was all due to the fact that Winchuck grew and distilled the fuel that let their vehicles run. But that power dynamic was set to be more balanced within the next year or so. O'Brien had been starting their own wheat and corn fields for the last 2 years, using all of the seed they harvested to replant and expand. But by next year, they projected to have enough harvest to replant and start making their own fuel. Predictably, the uppity assholes of Winchuck were not overly pleased with this development. But screw 'em. They'd been setting the trade price of ethanol for years, and the folks of O'Brien were getting tired of paying out the ass for every gallon of ethanol. 20 pounds of produce for a gallon of ethanol? Fucking extortion is what it was. Patrick had to remind himself that growing and trading were not his jobs. His job was to find any infected in the area of either settlement and take them out. Simple. And Patrick liked simple. Why complicate it with politics? He settled onto the roof of the cab, bracing himself for the hard acceleration that he knew was coming as the caravan reached a long, straight stretch of road, crowded by trees on either side, a section of the route known as Ambush Alley, another Hugoism. Patrick always got a little more heads up through Ambush Alley. It had earned its name. Here, the road was narrower than elsewhere, nature having slowly reclaimed the blacktop so that only a 6-foot-wide path remained following the double yellow lines. To either side, the woods had grown in so close and thick that searching branches sometimes clawed the sides of the vehicles as they passed. 5 separate infected attacks had happened on this single stretch of road, making it the most likely place in the entire route between the 2 settlements for shit to go sideways. Patrick felt the truck accelerate underneath him, trying to press him backwards, but he was leaning on the cab, scanning off the driver's side as the 3 engines in the caravan raised their voices to a roaring crescendo. Patrick remained firmly in the center of the vehicle, the better to avoid the raking branches that whipped by. One caught him anyways, just under the clear eye protection he wore, which was why he wore them in the first place. Having both eyes was kind of important for a tracker. He pivoted to the right, checking the woods on the passenger side, and almost missed it. When he turned, it was right there at the edge of the brush, but the truck was hauling ass at a solid 55 miles per hour, and the instant Patrick glimpsed it, it was gone in a flash. A face. He was damn sure of it. And if that's all it had been, Patrick would have let it go, because you don't stop the caravan in the middle of the route, and you especially don't stop the caravan in Ambush Alley. If anything, you speed the fuck up. But Patrick knew what he'd seen. That face had belonged to a sizable specimen. Dark, feral eyes and a dark-skinned face. Big black. And all Patrick needed was 2 seconds and a rifle in his hands, so the second the image of that passing face flashed through his consciousness, his hand was slamming on the top of the cab, and his mouth was shouting words he hadn't actively thought of. "Stop the fucking truck! Stop, stop, stop!" When you pound the cab and scream, you get a pretty instantaneous result. Tires locked up. Patrick was thrust painfully into the cab,